Hello and welcome to the Dame Caroline Hazlitt Collaboration Room. Today we're going to have a wonderful conversation on sustainability with Huda, who is an old friend and colleague. Huda is a regional civil engineer and a sustainable advisor at Tensar. And although we have been to school together, our careers have flourished in independent ways that have brought us back through a love of sustainability. Huda has always added something to the communities that she's been a part of, whether that is women in construction events, whether that is technical workshops at Tensar. And I always see people inspired by her enthusiasm and willingness to do whatever the project needs and to exceed its expectations. So I am really privileged to be here sat today with Huda. Hi Huda, thank you so much for being here. So the first question I wanted to ask is, when did sustainability become a part of your career?
Hi Amira, thank you so much for having me. Sustainability, I think, has always been a part of me. I think it's always been part of the intrinsicness of my personality without me realizing it. It's only when I got to my master's that I truly understood the definition of sustainability. But I think it was always a core part of my beliefs when I was talking about equity and I was talking about, experiences around the world relating to ourselves. So for me, when I actually went into my master's and I understood sustainable development goals, and all of the bits that are related in between, diversity and inclusion, all of these bits, that's when I truly understood what sustainability was, and I needed to make that part of my career.
And just on that, because you've talked about sustainability being part of what you do intrinsically, do you think there needs to be a separation or a definition of sustainability as opposed to it being a core part of everything?
I think it's so important to have sustainability defined. Me saying it's part of my intrinsic beliefs does not make it's a very subjective term, and the more I get into the commercial aspects of how to actually implement sustainability in the industry, the more I see it being watered down. And for me, greenwashing is a big fear. I see that within sustainability, we seem to focus the profit aspect and the economic aspect. That's not how I've learned sustainability to be defined, and yet that's what we continuously go back to. There's only any purpose in talking sustainability if there's a profit, quote unquote, and I don't think that's how it should be. And so defining sustainability and centering economic alongside environmental, alongside governance and society, it centers all of those things and not just about the profit of a few, but the benefit of everyone.
Okay, so just to summarize then, you see sustainability at its core as being an equally weighted definition between environment, economics, and social governance. Yeah?
Definitely.
Okay, great. So now talking about your career for a little bit, what is the part of your career or the thing you have achieved that you are the most proud of?
It's a really hard one. I'm proud of really centering collaboration, to be honest. Like, diversity of thought and conscious design are terms that I love to use, because the only way to get to the best solution at the end is to ask many people, right? And only by asking your opinion on that side of the world and your opinion with a different background to a different background to a different background do we get to a collaborative conclusion. And so for me, I think shouting about collaboration is just like kind of the concrete blocks, the foundation as to what I'm proud of, really.
Thank you very much for giving concrete and foundations I mentioned there. And this, I guess, is one kind of collaboration, right? The conversations that we're having right now. Okay, people have all of their different definitions of sustainability, as you've talked about before, their different priorities, their different agendas. What do you try and focus on in order to get something that in the end ends up sustainable, but it also achieves the desires of all of these different people working together?
That's a really loaded question. No, as you're talking, I've got this like popping off and this pinging off, and there are so many things. There's not a one size fits all. That's the key aspect. There is not a one size fits all. I've done research in quite a few different places, and the conclusion is always that it's not a one size fits all solution. But there's so many different frameworks to it. I would say first and foremost, I like to prioritize the waste hierarchy. I like looking at eliminating materials first and foremost. If we can eliminate a carbon high material, then do so. However, I would caveat that with saying you need to look at projects holistically, because reducing one aspect of a project in a major scheme needs to be reflective of what else is happening on that site, right? So, for example, if you're demolishing something at one part of the site, see if you can use that stone somewhere else. Think of all of the ways that transportation can be reduced in that sense. Materials bringing in, like virgin materials unnecessarily when you can use a recycled aggregate. But also introducing new materials at a first glance, you're thinking, whoa, why are we adding additional materials to this scheme? And that's not the norm. But there are so many new innovative products out there that you can add within a design, think about slightly differently, and holistically, despite adding that extra material, you're reducing the amount of carbon in that project, right? So you need to first and foremost be ready to think differently, be ready to design differently and less traditionally as well. So I would say, well, waste hierarchy and taking a step back to reflect on design, but also for me, centering it, it's often going back to the Brundtland report in a very, again, like really far back view, broad view of understanding that our goal is to provide for our current generations, but also provide the ability for future generations to also have access to such great construction, right? And such a great, like, booming industry, really. So for me, it's very much like, how are we doing that? If I'm constructing this, what's the maintenance going to be for the next 100 years, right? It's actually thinking long term about projects, what materials we're using. If we're creating a framework, which loads of councils are doing, is this even manageable in the long term because of the materials we're choosing to use? So I've got so many different frameworks for that, and that's just, mentioning a couple.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, which covered so many things. If there's anything I can contribute, I guess, is when I look at reuse of existing structure, reuse of existing buildings, I'm thinking about sustainability in exactly the ways you said, but the way I explain it to people is like, use things less, use them better, and reuse them. The toss up between, okay, we want to use a low carbon material, or we want to design for deconstruction. So you want to design something so that you can use it, for your building, but you can also deconstruct it and rebuild it elsewhere if it has a need elsewhere. Now, if you're doing the carbon calcs on that, maybe that's a more materially intensive approach. But actually, when you think about it in the long term, it's actually probably better and more useful for society. So these are all the conversations that we're having in my space, and your space is probably a lot more broad ranging than that, but I can like pick out the individual bits that you're saying and try to kind of apply them into what I do, which is a very specialist thing.
Just one last thing on that is that it's not always the easiest choice. We have quite a short-term mindset when we're thinking, when I'm seeing commercial decisions being made and your QS is looking at prices, they will look at it and they'll be like, well, that's pretty expensive. But we have to realize that investing now is what's going to help us in the long term. If you invest in a product that's not as good, that's not performing as well, or any other reason, it might not last as long, right? And so then you're going to continuously invest rather than thinking, long term, let's think of a solution for this. That was just one thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, so it's certainly the right financial decision. It's just the time window that your QS or whoever's looking at it is deciding to look at it, right? And I think we need to get better at like projecting the costs for those time scales so that we can, say to business owners or say to people who are putting money into this that actually this is the best financial decision for you and for the long-term value of your asset, right? People consider, in my view, a very kind of short-term approach to assets, which are kind of different to the way that, say, we think about homes. Like if you're buying a house, you're thinking about how to you are thinking about its future value, but you're also thinking about like, how do I make this kind of a home that I can live in and that works for me for several decades. And because you're passing it down to maybe people that you love, you do think about more of the long term. And I think that we need to think about everything in this way, because we are living, breathing occupiers of the spaces that we create. So sorry, that was a really long tangent that I went on. But I want to ask you, Huda, what does strong leadership in sustainability look like to you, and how would someone go about developing that?
I think what you've just said has led into that so well, because the question is, and sorry if this takes us off on another tangent, but if you're the person building your house, ultimately you're the client at the top, right? You're thinking about the people who are going to live there, i.e. yourselves and maybe your future generations. The people building it don't have that same benefit, right? So what incentive are there for the people further down the supply chain to be building it to that spec, right? Realistically, this is my issue, is that client at the top is saying, yeah, I want everything really low carbon. I want it like this, and I'm happy to invest in that. But ultimately, all the people on the supply chain, i.e. the contractors and the subcontractors and stuff like this, there needs to be some sort of incentive in it for them to implement what the dream is ultimately. Otherwise, they've got other jobs to get onto, right? The priority is, how much can I get done? They've got their own families and homes to take care of, and so they need to think about their investment of their time. So when it comes to leadership, what are we actually doing in leadership to incentivize everyone throughout the supply chain to do the specification, to do better, to eliminate, to reduce carbon, to think more consciously? And I don't think we're doing enough, if I'm truly honest. One thing, just to start off fairly positively, is, and obviously this is a long-term project that hasn't even begun yet, but Lower Thames Crossing, completely different mindset, I would say, to a lot of the other big schemes that are going on, where all of them mention carbon being at the forefront. Not many, in my opinion, have done enough to actually make that happen. But I've been following Lower Thames Crossing for a while now, and I've been attending a few of their road shows and stuff like this. And they have said they're putting carbon at the forefront, and they've put a money incentive scheme in place to make sure that that goes down all the way down the supply chain to benefit everyone who beats them on their carbon tracker. And for me, that's what leadership is. You have to understand what the buy-in is of the people to make what you need to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think if I were to summarize what you were saying, it's about creating win-win situations in terms of carbon management. How, for example, if you are in a team, you're focused on a sustainable aspect, but that's not what the rest of the team want. Or maybe even they're focused on sustainability because they have to be, but you don't feel like they're doing it in a meaningful way. How do you go about challenging or changing that?
Framing things completely differently. I don't even speak about carbon to some people, right? Because it's not worth their time and it's not in their interest. And there's no point preaching to people who it's not the most efficient use of their time. That's my opinion. And so I'll look at things and I'll be like, well, if this is a situation and you're just looking at the price between the two, I'll ask them further questions. So I'll be like, have you used this product before? How do you feel about it? Did it go well? And I'll look for a gap, comparing maybe two solutions together. And that's been working in some situations and it doesn't work in some situations. But I do find that, asking the right questions and finding what makes people tick, that's how I get to my solution. And at the end of it, I'll have the win because ultimately you've gone for a more sustainable solution. But also I'll make sure that the other person wins, right? I'll make sure that ultimately their project finishes 12 days faster. They can jump onto the next one. If that was their tick, I'll make sure that project ends faster. If it's the fact that you've had a really bad experience with previous innovations, and so the idea of using an innovative product is quite worrying, I'll make sure that PI has nothing to do with you, right? And you have to look at what people actually find, what the reason is, and sustainability, hence why it's so broad in that sense, because you having nothing to do with the environment but making a different decision is ultimately contributing to sustainability, right? And hence why it changes in definition throughout the whole thing. You with me so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting what you said. I think it feeds into how multifaceted this job really can be. It's interesting that you say that most of the rooms where you engage with people, they don't care about sustainability that much, and you often have to kind of shout above the room in order to be heard. My question is that it's a buzzword everywhere. Why do people not care? Why do most people still not care? That's a really difficult question, but I'm just interested to hear what your thoughts are about that.
There's probably so many different reasons. I would say demographic is probably a key one to touch on, to be honest. A lot of the people that we have that have shared so much knowledge in the industry have been in the industry for a long time, right? It's often a very particular demographic. It's often very similar mindsets, right? And so for me, if you have people who have the same background in the same space, there is less likelihood of new thoughts penetrating that circle, right? And so for me, I feel like I'm often, if you look at me, I'm an Asian woman, I wear a headscarf. I would say I'm fairly young. People might disagree. And so I'm very different to what I come across quite commonly in the industry. And I think that's really useful, I think people need to see different types of people, because ultimately what I'm preaching about is because of the research that I've done in South Africa, in Kenya. One of my first research was using plant fibers to reinforce concrete, right? Completely nothing to do with inclusion, nothing to do with diversity, but it is to do with sustainability in the sense of we don't have access to steel around the world. It's not affordable around the world, and it's definitely a very carbon-heavy product, right? And the lab experiments were so fun, but I did find out that the fibers that I was using wasn't even comparable to steel, right? But it was so interesting because later that year I found banana leaves being used in construction places and different types of soil. And it just opened up that door to realize that the way that we construct in the UK isn't the only way to construct, right? And so I think it's quite difficult to understand sustainability because it changes depending on the pressures that you have in that environment. Maybe a less economically developed country would have different pressures of accessing certain materials. But what we're experiencing in the UK right now is really rocketing high prices for materials like aggregates, right? Sizewell C is importing aggregates from Norway and from the other side of the country and all over to get a good quality of aggregate, and they're charging extortionate prices for it. HS2 used such a high amount of aggregates that everyone else was struggling to actually access a good price of aggregates, right? And so sustainability is defined by a lot of the issues that you're experiencing in that region, but ultimately we're all connected. That's the way I see it. So I do feel like it's a really difficult period at the moment because we're trying to implement change in an industry that hasn't had to really experience change for years. I was previously working in scaffolding, and if you speak to a scaffolder, they are so well versed in what they're doing, but you teach them a different way and they're like, yo, that's a bit difficult for me. That's not even difficult, actually. I'm not really interested in that. So it's really hard in that sense, getting the right people to understand what you're talking about. But ultimately, I think we are all trying to be better in different ways. And so the best approach is to listen to everyone, understand what the values are, and see what's actually feasible. Because often one final solution at the end can combat so many different things that people are trying to achieve, right? And this is why we have like bespoke solutions, is that we're actually considering multiple different aspects of what we want to achieve. And so the solution at the end, hence the not one size fits all, it should be bespoke to what the needs are of that project or of that design or of the people involved.
I think one thing I would add is, you mentioned the example about the scaffolder, and usually I think people in trades are really good at what they do, and it really helps to speak to them directly because they have that grounded knowledge in what's going on, right? You change one thing, they know how it affects what the design is. The thing is, though, if that person's boss or their boss's boss said, right, now everything has to be sustainable, now we have to reuse tubes from this manufacturer, right, everything changes. Now all the dynamics change, which is, I guess, where the leadership comes in again. So it's that like multifaceted approach I feel that you need to talk to business owners in order to get them on board, because what they say kind of goes with the employees in the company. That's just one thing that I've noticed. Another thing I have noticed is that as broad as sustainability is, we don't do as much social engagement as we should do. And even when I'm building projects that the public will use, for example, schools, studios, community spaces, there's such an opportunity to get people in to see what's being done, to kind of create temporary spaces to like exhibit local work. There are places and projects that really do this so well, and turning it into a real quality offering for the local public. There could be a much better exchange between us as the professionals and the general public in terms of learning and creating public spaces. So, Huda, we've talked about what's missing in the sustainability space in construction, and one of those key parts was about social sustainability, social value. Obviously, that's talking about people, right? So what demographics or what people do you think are being missed out in construction?
No, I really appreciate that question, to be honest, because, yeah, like you said, we've touched on demographics that the construction industry has and how that contributes to the solution overall. And I think that the industry isn't the most accessible for everyone. I think a lot of people who are in the industry have come through that through heritage, maybe. It's been part of the norm in the family, and so maybe that's why they've jumped into it. I would say I'm really privileged because there aren't that many people who look like me or have my background in the industry. And under normal circumstances, maybe I wouldn't even be here. But because the school that we went to specialized in engineering, I feel like I got so much more of a lead in understanding what engineering even meant. And so that was when I was 14, and I don't know any other 14-year-old that was thinking about engineering at the time, and this has been something that's been on my mind for 15 years now.
Do you have engineers in your family?
I have not a single engineer in my family, actually. That's just occurred to me. So it's never been, my family all have very different experiences. There's no one in my family that does engineering, actually. And so this accessibility aspect is so important, because how do we get to a diverse solution at the end, or a sustainable solution, without having a number of different backgrounds involved and actually contributing to that? So in that as well, like I remember when we were designing scaffolding, one of the things I consistently had to check and consistently found mistakes in is that there wasn't space for pushchairs or wheelchairs to go through scaffolding. And, you know, women and disabled people, or parents and disabled people even, are part of our society. Why are we not building for that? Why are we expecting people in a wheelchair to go around a scaffolding, right? That's not the way. And that's not to the standard. There is a standard that's meant to include these, but mistakes are often made. And so in that as well, like, where's the passage of communication from the specifier to the contractor as well, right? And what you're designing isn't always happening on site, so that communication is really important.
And sorry, to add to that, I think it's really important to stress that if there was a disabled person in that room or a wheelchair user in that room making those decisions, you would never have a case where it's been neglected, right? Which is why we're talking about representation here. Sorry to just interrupt.
No, you're totally right as well. I recently thought about PPE accessibility for women as well. Like, if we are not in personal protective equipment as women on site, where's the accessibility if we're not protected? What is pulling me to stay in construction if I'm not feeling protected? And maybe there's probably a number of reasons as to why there aren't many women in the industry. But I often hear, as soon as a woman gets married, managers are like, oh, well, she'll be off on maternity leave soon. There's this assumption that people will have children. I don't operate under that assumption, right? And I don't think anyone should be. So we need to kind of not assume what people's lifestyles are going to be as, and yet we need to provide for whatever they are going to be. And so if you do decide to have a child and you come back from maternity leave, I have yet to be to a site that has a space for a woman to pump in peace. You know, it like these kind of educational aspects of giving birth and like maternity leave and returning to work, I don't think there's enough focus on it, to be honest. And when I go to site, there's barely even a toilet that's accessible to women because it's often locked, or, you know, it's not available or whatever it is. So in so many different levels of this, right, we've gone through people having children, but also people just accessing toilets on site, to wellness. All of these aspects coming together is not currently being considered. I would say another one to consider is neurodivergence. One thing I learned like maybe 3 or 4 years ago is that they started making these welfare cabins that are soundproof. And so if the sound is too much on a site, and there's so much noise going on, like, you know, there's all sorts of noise, having that bit of silence can just calm your brain for a minute. That will allow so many more people who are autistic or whatever the reason is, to have that moment of peace, and maybe that site will seem more accessible for them in the long term.
And I think it's really important here to mention that when we do things that promote accessibility, they benefit everyone. Like, they might be targeted towards people with particular needs, but in general, they help everyone. Like, for example, you have shared parental leave if you're talking about people taking leave. And I understand that there's this thing where someone's taking a career break for whatever reason, and there could be any number of reasons: health reasons, caring for an elderly person, caring for a sick person. You know, we need to get better at making systems that support people. Improve your data collection systems, improve your note taking, utilize automation and technology. Like, you don't have to rely on this one person. You can facilitate a handover very well. You know, we just need to make better operation of the tools that we have available in order to be able to give people dignified working careers. Definitely. And it would retain people as well, I feel. And we started in a very kind of technical engineering discipline. We've transitioned over to sustainability. Now, I have my reasons, I'm sure you have yours, but this happens to be a trend that we are seeing, where women reach mid-management levels and they kind of transition elsewhere. Do you think accessibility is one of the reasons behind this? And can you talk a little bit more about your personal journey, but also what you think this trend is telling us?
For sure, yeah. I think, just to touch on what you've just said as well, we shouldn't make people fight for change. We should just provide it. I think that's a really, really good point there, in the sense of, if that one person that you really need is struggling, great, we'll make it easier for them. But why did we not make it easier to begin with, right? And yeah, I guess linked to my experiences, there's been so many times throughout my career where my quote unquote difference has always been dismissed, right? As a regular occurrence. And when I have very much shouted about the fact that this isn't for my benefit, this is for your long-term retention, this is for the morale to be more positive, this is so you can actually keep your people, progress them, work on that, and then keep them content and happy. It's interesting because it definitely is often on my mind that the construction industry isn't for me, and yet I go into a sustainability room and I feel heard and I don't have to say anything, right? Which is such an interesting feeling, because from going to fighting for what I want and what I need in the construction industry to going to like my first sustainability conference years ago and being like, wow, there are people who think like me. But I look between the two rooms and it's completely different people in them, right? And I think that there is this wave of not feeling acceptance in the industry, and loads of people who do make it in, who maybe are different from the demographic that's the norm. I think a lot of them have to change a lot of their personality. I'm not saying this is everyone. I think I know people that have maintained their wonderful personalities as well, but it's difficult, right? It's difficult to stick to your roots and to your beliefs when everything around you is trying to convince you that you don't fit in, or you're wrong, or you're not supposed to be there. And so this trend of moving from construction to sustainability, at first I thought it was just a few of us and it was just a coincidence, but I'm seeing now that there are a lot of people of color, a lot of women in the sustainability industry, right?
That's a really interesting point. I'm going to try and touch on a few things. A consulting role is a privilege over a building or designing role, because you can just tell someone what they have to do, and it's much easier to tell someone what they have to do and what they should do and get all of the data to support that than actually do it. That's what I found is a much more uphill struggle as a designer. But also, I think there could be an aspect of sustainability being a newer space. If it's a newer space, it's kind of nucleated by the people of a more modern kind of demographic. So, as women come into the construction industry in greater and greater numbers than there have been before, if a new kind of discipline nucleates, it's naturally going to have more women in it because they make up more of the engineering kind of contingent anyway. I think there's more of a culture of globalization. There's more of a culture of you don't have to stay at the same company for your entire career. So people realize that if things don't work for them, they just move. And I think that's what we're seeing. And the fact that people can just move means that they're probably going to leave. I know construction has a retention problem generally, not just with women. It has a problem generally where people don't feel like necessarily the wages that they're getting and the responsibility and risk that they undertake is worth it, and they could take on professions which are lower risk and pay better or suit their lifestyles better. So I think all of these play into why you're seeing demographics differently between sustainability and more general construction. What I think is going to be difficult now is bridging that gap, right? Really turning all of this sustainable, like XYZ, you have to do all of this, into reality, because people have more choice to go into one or the other. There kind of needs to be this integration where these things are collaboratively working. I think that's a problem. And I think it's less of a problem when companies are large and they're making big profits and they have international investment. You don't have that much resilience in the economy, you're not going to try new things, right? You're looking at day-to-day profit generation, quarter-to-quarter profit generation. So I think that this is going to be something that's really, really hard now and in the future. On that point, we've signed up to the Paris Agreement, net zero by 2050. when we eventually get there, which I don't think will be 2050, but when we eventually get there, what happens to sustainability as a concept? What do you think is the future of our field?
I think if sustainability dies, humanity dies with it. I really think that as much as it might have been born for the Paris Agreement or the UN or like in so many different ways, I think that just like environmental justice has always been led by indigenous people, people of color, those wars have always been led by the people who haven't had the best outcome. It's the same concept. Like, I can't imagine a world where everything is perfect. So for that, I mean, we have to carry on trying until it is, right? Even if we hit all of those goals and we're on track for the climate to calm down, I still don't think that mitigates maybe all of the history that this has come through as well. Like, look at the companies that are producing the highest carbon, right? The lives that they have impacted around the world, like 100 years or 50 years is not going to mitigate that, right? And so in a social way, I think we're going to continuously have to work to be better. And it's really difficult as well because things are getting streamlined through AI, right? How much water does the AI data center require, right? Where is that lack of water affecting? There are towns being affected by huge droughts right now, right? And so in that same concept, if you look at, the supply chain of so many different products and stuff like this, I won't go too into depth because it can take us off entirely. But I think in that sense, there is always work to do. As soon as someone says, oh, this is a sustainable thing, I question it. Because that to me means that you seem to have hit a dead end, but there's always work to be done, right? So if by some miracle we hit these 2050 goals, I think there probably be other avenues to go down. And if you look at each of the Sustainable Development Goals, do all women have access to education? Do all people around the world have access to water? Like, these are bare minimum human needs, right? So I would say be very skeptical of a lot of these goals that we make because they are often benefiting the privileged, the first world countries, the more economically developed countries, whatever you want to call it. There's always more work to be done in other places.
You know, I think you're right, and I think I'm going to step back and say, actually, sustainability was not generated because of our climate commitments, because I think about the way that my grandma lived, and I think about the way that everyone's grandma lived, right? And it was like reusable nappies for the kids, and it was like you take your shoe to the menders, right? You mend your shoe, you don't buy a new shoe. So the way that people lived was way more sustainable. We just didn't have kind of the words, and we weren't commercializing those concepts as much. Now that we have a bit more stake in the future world and that we're considering it a bit more, what are the things that we are going to learn and how we're going to implement those, right? In order to unlock meaningful sustainability, there's obviously a data collection exercise that needs to be done because we're measuring things differently. We are, presenting that data all differently. How do we begin? And obviously we have a lot of technology that can collect and sort that data really well for us. What do we need to be looking at? And how do we need to be approaching data in terms of sustainability? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm glad you said thoughts rather than answers because I definitely don't have an answer. I would say two main things have jumped into my head when you've been asking that. The two things being one, uniformity, and two, transparency. I don't know about you, but it feels like a lot of people are gatekeeping. And as soon as you start centering your knowledge away from other people's, we're not working as a community. My mindset is very community-based. Sustainability is community-based. As soon as we're not being transparent and we're coming up with our own carbon calculators, data collection methods, ways of calculating an EPD from different countries and stuff like this, we're kind of moving further away from the goal. It, again, comes back to profit because ultimately you want to sell this on or you want to be known for X, Y, Z. That is not what sustainability is, in my opinion. You know, we have to, like, knowledge sharing, collaboration is at the forefront. So as soon as we're not being uniform, and I don't think it's possible to be a completely uniform, right? But I think having a concept that is shared in the UK market, and then you can share it with other European markets, and then you can, like, you know, you can go Eastern and Western Hemisphere, stuff like this, right? There needs to be some sort of aspects of sharing, and not just the end of, this is this much embodied carbon. How did we get to that number? You know, what was considered? Have you gone back to the virgin materials, or are you actually only considering it for when it hits the land, right? And a lot of EPDs are, the environmental product declarations, they start from when they begin in the UK, but they've been shipped from, you know, Germany or China, or wherever it is.
So how do organizations approach this collaboration in your view? Do they get all of their heads of sustainability together and say, look, this is what we need to achieve?
One step I think that is really good are all of these working groups. So you've got like the AGS working group, and you have the AGS sustainability working group. You've got the BGA one. I'm part of a few of them, and I would say academics are always dismissed, but academics are always at the, you know, you have to say, like, listen to your academics. Journals and articles and data collection, going through the methodology, and then the outcome, and then the improvements. These all need to be collated together, and having a working group with people from different companies, different backgrounds, and sharing what their company has done, I would say is a great way forward. Like, it's not gonna happen tomorrow, but these movements of working together, collating this information, sharing EPDs and sharing methodologies, writing papers together, like having more than one name on a paper, for me, I'm like, great, you've at least considered other people, right? And these are just small steps I think we can be taking.
So I guess my last question is there anything you want to add?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me. I absolutely think we need to have more conversations like this, where we're just sharing knowledge. We don't have the answers. Like, as much as I'd love to give you all of the answers, I don't have the answers, right? One business I guess I would like to give a shout out to that's giving free sustainability knowledge very clearly, very openly, with a diverse set of backgrounds, not just construction, is the Sustainability Supply Chain School. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. I would say knowledge at the forefront of everything. Don't jump to your answers, but have a wide variety of knowledge before putting your foot forward. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really had the best time, and yeah, I hope I've not gone on too many tangents, but it is always a pleasure to speak with you, Mira.
Thank you, Huda, and thank you to the Royal Society of Arts for hosting us. Thank you to Dame Caroline Hazlitt for her legacy and this collaboration room, and hopefully see you in the future for a discussion where we can build on some of the points that we've mentioned here. That would be amazing. So thanks very much, and see you soon. We will drop some resources in the link, because we've talked about so many different organizations and sustainability credentials here. So we're going to drop a bunch of links in the description for you all to have a little research for yourselves. Thanks very much. Bye.